So after nearly 2 hours of lectures, we finally reached the end of this particular section, and we will talk about this last concept of continuous deployment. So let's head on into this section and let's complete our study of deployment and releasing. Okay, I have on multiple occasions in this lecture emphasized that perfect software is almost impossible. All software will eventually fail. However, the sooner your software fails, the better. You see, why do I say so? Assume that this is your software and you have just this is a stable version of your software. It has been in production for 2 years or 3 years, I don't know, and now you've decided to add a small module to it, add more features to it. Not a small module, you've decided to add features F1, F2, up to F10, 10 more features to it. Now assume a situation where you create F1 and then you immediately release your software as this is version 1. You are going to release it as version 1.1, not as version 2 but as version 1.1. What is the advantage that you have here? You see, this portion is highly stable because it has been in production. A lot of people have used it. You've received a lot of user reviews. Since you've made sufficient changes, most bugs have been tracked. However, if there is a bug in version 1.1, there is a high chance that this bug came from this particular module that we just added, or rather it is because of the feature F1 that version 1.1 has errors. It could be because of the old module also, but the chances of the error being caused because of F1 is really high. And so when the software fails, when the deployment fails, you need to test F1 first. If you can test F1 first and make sure that that F1 doesn't have errors, and only when you're sure that the error is not caused by F1 do you need to check the remaining portion, right? Usually the bug will have been caused because of F1. So you are saved from the trouble of having to go through such huge code. You can easily roll back to the stable version and then fix the errors that are there in F1 and then redeploy your software. Okay. However, what about the other situation? What's the other option that we have? The first option that I said was you can add F1 and then leave it like that, right? The next option that you have is take your stable version, add F1, F2, F3, F4, F5, F6, F7, F8, F9 and F10. Add all 10 features and you have a really fat software. It's really fat. It's consumed all those features. It's become really fat. You have this big software and only a bit of this code is stable, a little bit of it is stable, but the rest of it is not stable at all, right? This portion, this green portion is stable, but the red portion is not stable at all. So when this deployment fails, how do we debug it? How can we debug our software in case of this particular setup? Right, the green portion, only the green portion is stable. The rest of it is not stable at all. So when we debug, when we have customers complain about this particular software, then we have to debug a lot, right? There is a lot of work that we need to do. We need to check feature F1, F2, F3, F4, F5, F6, F6. We have to check all of them to be sure that the trouble was to see where the bug actually is, right? So we will ideally want our software to be updated or released in small pieces, right? Features to be added to our software in small pieces so that we can easily debug it. Uh, uh, Also, you would want your software to fail as early as possible, and so you perform as much testing as possible also, and so that you don't waste more time assuming that everything is fine. See, this process of releasing very small changes as soon as they have passed the test without really waiting for other modules to be complete is what is called continuous deployment. We're not waiting for every other change also to occur. We've made a small change and we're immediately releasing that change into the market. And I've just given you the advantage of this approach. But anyway, this process of releasing every small change without waiting for other changes to be added on is what you call deployment pipeline. I'm sorry, it's called continuous deployment. Okay. continuous deployment practice, for this, it may it may become obvious to you that with continuous deployment, for continuous deployment to happen properly, our deployment process will need to be automated. It will need proper automation to enable continuous deployment, because if it is not automated, then it will take time for each change to be promoted through each stage in our deployment pipeline. And so it mandates that automation must be there. It mandates that automation be made part of the deployment pipeline. You need an automated deployment pipeline. And also, uh, what is the other advantage? The other advantage is that every small change reaches the customer quickly, and so you can test it out test it out immediately. So these two things, right? These two things are the main advantages of continuous deployment. It forces you to automate, right? If we decide that we're going to follow continuous deployment right from the beginning, then we know that we will require automation, and so we will be forced to use automation in case we decide to follow continuous deployment philosophy. Right? This sounds very interesting, although this is a very interesting topic and it seems very promising. This is quite difficult in the case of client installed application. For example, if you're using the online version of Microsoft Office 365, right? Assume that you are using the online version of Microsoft Office 365. So whenever Microsoft adds a new feature to Office 365, this it will be available to you, right? When I say feature, it could be a bug fix also. Whenever Microsoft performs a bug fix or adds a new feature to Office 365, it will be available to you, because Microsoft has full control over the online version of Office 365. They have control over the production environment. They own the production environment. However, in the case of offline version, right, in the case of the offline version of Office, Microsoft does not have as much control. You are using Office 365 offline version in your own computer, in your computer, right? In your computer, unless you permit Microsoft to access your computer, there is no way Microsoft can access your application. So a feature that they've introduced will not enter your system unless you have manually downloaded that feature and added that onto Microsoft Office, right? So continuous deployment is not easy in the case of installed software. So what is our workaround, or how can we ensure continuous deployment in the case of user client installed applications? There is only one way we can do it. That way is to provide updates, through uh, through through the internet, through over the air, to provide these updates over the air, right? And how do we do this? One option is, whenever you've added a new feature, you can notify the user. You can notify that a new feature has been added and would you like to install it. And if the user feels interested, then he can take the feature, he can download the feature and install it into the application. Second option is that each time there is a new update available, automatically download it. You download that automatically. The software will automatically download it. You will push it. You would push the download automatically. However, before installing the feature, you will ask the user whether he would like to install it. Before you install it, you will ask your user whether he wants to install it or not. This happens a lot with Microsoft Windows. If you use Windows, Microsoft will automatically download or push updates into your system. It will be downloaded into your system, particularly with Microsoft Windows 10. It's quite difficult to turn off updates even if you don't want them. Uh, these they will be downloaded, and later on they will prompt you whether you would like to install the update. It will tell you all the features and ask you if you'd like to install it. If you want to install it, it will be installed. Otherwise, the update will remain in your computer till you delete it off. And the third option is, don't ask for updates, don't ask for permission, don't ask anything at all. Just download the update, install it, and then once the installation is done, let the user know that you have updated the software. I mean, it seems a little rough on the users to do this. It seems a little rough, the third method, but it is actually the best method, because now the software will always be up to date. You may have noticed that your Chrome browser is always up to date even though you don't really update it yourself in your PC. Even though you don't update it yourself, it's always up to date. It's because Google Chrome always downloads the update and it updates itself in the background, and then when you turn off your Chrome and then turn it on again, it will install all the updates, right? That is how Chrome does it. So you're essentially forcing the user to update. So those are three ways. One is notifying them, right? Second is downloading and prompting, downloading and then notifying them, downloading and then the third one is the forceful way. Just install it and then let the user know that you've installed the updates. So these are three ways in which you can deliver or you can perform continuous deployment in the case of client-side client installed applications. Right. So thank you. I'm sorry for that premature thank you because it's not over yet. We have one small topic left before we can say goodbye. Right? We've covered now nearly all essential topics in this area, but I will leave you with a few tips and tricks that will help you in your journey as software developers who will one day be be deploying your applications, right? Uh, these are some tips that we can take to heart uh, and uh, and also try and comprehend each of them properly so that it becomes useful to you and it is not just academic, that this particular section is not just an academic exercise. So please try to understand the philosophy behind each of these tips and try to practice them as well. As mentioned earlier in the release strategy section, when preparing the release plan, we must make sure that all stakeholders are part of this planning and that their roles are very carefully drafted. The whole team must be involved in the deployment process because there are bound to be bugs there in the system that you were not able to track in the previous stage. At each stage you will be uncovering new bugs and they need to be identified and fixed before we can put the system in production. This requires the support of the whole team, from unit testing to user acceptance testing and gamma testing. It requires support of the entire stakeholder team. And to make sure that when you're working in teams, communication becomes essential. And therefore, every activity that is done in the previous state needs to be logged properly. It needs to be noted down properly, right? Every every step that you did that led to a particular error or a successful test passing must be logged down so that we know how exactly the application works. So logging your deployment activities is quite important. I'm not just talking about the test cases and the testing activities, but also the whole deployment activity. How did we deploy it into that particular environment? How did we do it in the capacity testing environment? How did we finally do the canary release? All of the activities that we did needs to be logged down so that we can so that we can know how exactly the application works. And when we speak of logging, we must understand that keeping track of the older versions and older configurations and also the older reports, older logs, that is also quite important. We must all learn from history, right? We learn from the history. And also, whenever our current version runs into some serious issue, we can always roll back to the older version. Right? We can always roll back to the older version of your software in case of an issue as well. There is a general tendency to throw out older versions, but please refrain from it. Do not delete the older versions from your system. Right? Uh, please leave this out. Now, this point, it may not be very relevant today, right? Today, these days, everybody uses. No, I mean, very few people use GUI on the server side. We use command line execution for servers. So why is it suggested that we go for command lines in the server side, right? The server doesn't really interact with any of the clients. The people who create the server, are usually the people who operate it as well, or maybe some of the operations team will be the people who are operating. They have really good technical knowledge, and so you don't really need a graphical user interface for them. That is one reason, right? You don't need a graphical user interface for them. There is no point in developing a graphical user interface and then testing the GUI. There's no point in that. We can just rely on a command line interface. So the second point is that if it's a graphical user interface, it implies that a human being is required to operate the server, right? However, if we use a command line interface, then we can use scripts to automate the server as well, right? We can automate the server too if it is a command line operated server. If it's a graphical user server, then it becomes a lot more difficult to automate your server. When you're working on a really long project, when it's a really long project, um, there is a tendency that you might want to release your project at the earliest, and because of course when you do something, you want people to see it, and you want people to appreciate it, and so there is a tendency that you might be a little hasty. You might be a little hasty in the deployment part. You must never be hasty in the deployment. You've developed the process really well, you've tested enough, and now the deployment part needs to be done carefully as well. You should not hurry it and then without sufficient smoke tests you just release your application. Don't do that. Perform enough testing on your application and don't be in a hurry to deploy your application. The next point is about failing fast. Right? We had an extensive discussion about this in just the previous section on continuous deployment. You want your application to fail fast so that the errors don't become too complex. Of course, you ideally you don't want your application to fail at all, but if it fails, you want it to fail really fast. And this is not, it's not as if you want your application to fail fast. Don't misinterpret this concept and say that you want all applications to fail. That's not what it means. The assumption here is that you don't have perfect software, and even if you have a software, and if the software is going to fail, then you should be then it should happen fast so that you can fix it fast, right? The last point, or the last point that you should keep in mind is avoid making changes directly to production, right? Assume that the product is in production, you try and avoid making direct changes directly into production. You make changes to it and then you test it out properly, and then finally once it's ready, deploy it into production. Don't make changes on the fly. Don't make changes to a system that is already in production, because you may have fixed a small issue. You may have made a change and fixed a small issue, but this issue may cause a chain of other issues that you may not have been able to foresee or understand. So once you've added this new change to your system, without you even knowing, there would be a chain reaction and it would end up causing huge fatal errors in your system. So you don't want this to happen. Try and avoid making changes to the system on the fly. Try and avoid making changes to the production directly, right? If there is an issue, then roll back, make the older version available to the users, and then make changes. The reason why I cut off this point was because it was already discussed in the first part. You want involvement of the whole team, and the whole team must be involved in the decision making and planning also. So these are a few points that I'm sure will help you out, although they're not very difficult at all. It's very important that you understand why we suggest these points to people who are employed in the deployment or the operations part of a software. Right. So with this, we come to the end of our discussion on deployment, and I hope that you have a clear idea of what deployment is and how things happen in the deployment and release stage of a software. Please read all of the resources that I provided to you, and use this lecture as a guiding light that will make reading your textbooks a lot easier. Your textbook is the only resource that you should believe 100%, right? That's the only resource you should believe 100%. No other resource, no internet resource, nothing has been reviewed as much as your textbooks. So rely on your textbooks and use these classes to help you out when needed. Thank you so much for your patient listening. Thank you, and I hope you continue to stay healthy and I hope that we can meet very soon.